Welcome to Biology Made Easy. Today we are comparing passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. All these are processes by which substances move across cell membranes, both cell surface membrane and membranes of organelles. At the end of the lesson, you have question to solve, and this is the question. If there is a specific substance or molecule that needs to move across membrane, suggest when each of the processes, passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport, will be employed. So, for our lesson, passive diffusion is the movement of a substance, this is the substance, from the region of high concentration of the substance to a region of lower concentration of a substance across a cell membrane, all right? That is passive diffusion. And the movement of the substance is through the pores in between the phospholipids. Now, facilitated diffusion is movement of a substance from a region of high concentration of the substance to a region of lower concentration of the substance across the membrane, and it's through membrane proteins. Carrier proteins carry the substances across the membrane. Active transport is the movement of substances from a region of low concentration of the substance to a region of high concentration of the substance through membrane proteins, and energy from ATP is used to drive the movement from region of low concentration to a region of high concentration. Looking at the process in a bit of a detail, so we have this table. Passive diffusion, therefore, substances move along concentration gradient from high concentration to a low concentration. So it's along concentration gradient. Facilitated diffusion, substances move along concentration gradient from a high concentration to a low concentration. Active transport, substances move against concentration gradient. The gradient is lower here, and yet the substances will be moved across. Now, more differences. In passive diffusion, the substances move across the membrane and is through pores in between the phospholipids. So there will be pores. So you see, we have the substances moving through this, coming through the pore, coming through the pore. That is passive diffusion. Very tiny pores. Facilitated diffusion, substances move across the membrane through transmembrane proteins, channel proteins, and carrier proteins. Active transport, the substances move across the membrane through transmembrane proteins, channel proteins, and carrier proteins. Now, passive diffusion, only tiny molecular weight substances can move across. Very tiny, like water molecules and small ions or solutes, they can move across. Facilitated diffusion, small or large molecules can be transported. For instance, small molecules like water can be transported through channel proteins called aquaporins. We discussed this in our previous lesson, aquaporins. So small molecules or large molecules can go through transmembrane proteins. Active transport too can transport small or large molecules because they are going through transmembrane proteins. And as we discussed in our previous lesson, you have glucose transporters that will transport large quantities of glucose through membrane proteins. Now, passive diffusion, no ATPs are involved. In fact, energy is provided by the concentration gradient. Facilitated diffusion, no ATP is employed. The concentration gradient itself is an energy force, and then carrier proteins need to change their form when they are transporting substances. And if carrier proteins can change their forms, it's not by ATP, it's by what is called ligands. And the ligands are ions that can donate electrons to other molecules that will change the form of the carrier protein. Now, active transport, ATP is involved to change the form of the carrier protein. Change it. We discussed this in our lessons that need to check. Then Passive diffusion is a slow process. Facilitated diffusion is a fast process. Active transport, fast process. You know why it's fast? Because it employs transmembrane proteins. And then passive diffusion does not depend on oxygen concentration or glucose concentration. This also does not depend on oxygen concentration or glucose concentration because ATPs are not involved. But here, ATPs are involved, and so it depends on oxygen concentration and glucose concentration. Now, note that osmosis is passive diffusion of water molecules. Now, let's get a question and the answers. Question is, again, if there is a specific substance or molecule that needs to move across membrane, suggest when each of the processes, passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport, will be employed. Here is the answer. 1. For passive transport, as long as there's a concentration gradient, passive transport occurs. So as long as there's a concentration gradient, tiny molecules move in between the phospholipids as long as there's a concentration gradient and as long as the molecules are tiny. So the molecules in passive diffusion move through here. So in facilitated diffusion, passive diffusion also occurs because the molecules move in between the pores from high concentrated area to the low concentrated area across. In active transport too, so long as there's a concentration gradient and so long as the molecules are tiny to be able to pass through the pores in between the phospholipid, passive transport occurs. So in active transport, tiny molecules will still move across the pores, through the pores in between the phospholipids. So passive transport will be occurring even in active transport, and the molecules will move from here to here, while active transport is pushing it faster. So passive transport occurs all the time so long as there's a concentration gradient and so long as the molecules are tiny to pass through the pores in between. And then passive transport occurs so long as the cell or the organelle needs the substance and there's a concentration gradient. So substances move into a cell or out of a cell as long as concentration gradients occur, as long as the substance is tiny, as long as the cell needs the substance to come in or go out. Go out when it's a waste substance, it must go out. And passive diffusion occurs even when active transport is occurring if the substance is tiny. Well, then 2. Facilitated diffusion occurs when large amounts of substance will need to come in or out depending upon the concentration gradient. So the substance will come in, facilitated diffusion, if there's concentration gradient. And if large amounts or the substance will need to come in fast, right? And there's a concentration gradient, then facilitated diffusion will be used to bring the substance in or to bring the substance out. If it's a waste or excess waste products that needs to go out, excess product that needs to go, and the concentration gradient is there, facilitated diffusion will take place to get the substance in fast or out fast. Then active transport also occurs when there's the need for a substance plenty to come in fast. When the cell needs it, it will happen. Whether it is small, if the cell needs to get it inside, whether it's small outside, active transport will be used to bring it in or take it out if it's depending upon whether the cell needs the substance or has to take the substance out. Then it will use active transport. So to sum it up, passive diffusion occurs if there is concentration gradient, if the substance is tiny or small, can go through the pores. Sometimes there's no concentration gradient. Right? And then facilitated diffusion or active transport is working. This is what time allows us today. The lesson has been useful. Give us your likes. Kindly do subscribe if you haven't done so. Thank you very much. Goodbye.